Good morning. My name is Becky Metcalfe, and on behalf of Design Centre Chelsea Harbour, a very warm welcome to Conversations in Craft. A bit of housekeeping. If I could ask you to turn your phones to silent, that would be really great. So this series has been specially created to coincide with Artefact. It's our first contemporary craft fair here, and it's a chance to hear from some of the leading lights in the world of craft. So I'm delighted to introduce our guest panellists today, Marijke Varrall-Jones, founding director of Maak, Corinne Julius, curator, journalist, critic, broadcaster, Simone Brewster, who's an artist and designer, and Lucy Swift, who's the curator of Cluster London. And chairing the session today is Grant Gibson, podcaster and writer. Before I hand over to Grant, I think we should give them a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. You can keep going if you like. We won't do any talking. It's wonderful to see you. I just want to kind of stare at you all for a moment because you're not on a screen. Well, you're on a screen if you're watching at home, sorry, but you are not on a screen. You're actually here in 3 dimensions. It's really quite exciting. Thank you very much for coming. Before we get into all this, it'd be quite nice, I think, for the panel to know a little bit about who you are, because at the moment you're slightly dark figures in a room and we're all lit up. So can I just have a show of hands? Do we have collectors in the audience? Or people who identify as collectors? Not so much. Makers? A couple? Well, you don't look entirely certain, but yeah. Designers? Okay. Architect? Well, we could talk about that, but unfortunately I'm not allowed to because you're masked up. Architects? Media types? Got a couple? Hello. Anybody I've missed out? Anybody I've missed out who I should be mentioning? No. Okay, so we know who everybody is. We are live streaming this, and it will be recorded, so if we can avoid swearing, I think is probably a bad thing, I imagine. Yes, but we're here to talk about collecting, the collecting habit. I mean, as Becky has alluded to, we have a panel here with a range of expertise, and we're going to hope to get to the bottom of why we collect and what we collect. So we have Marijke, who is from Maak, which is an auction house that specialises in ceramics. Corinne, as we've discovered, is a journalist, curator, possibly a collector. We'll get into that. Lucy, on my far right, is a curator at Cluster London, which is an organisation devoted to showcasing a new generation of makers and hopefully a new generation of buyers. I think that's a reasonable... Is that reasonable? Yeah. You're nodding? Good. Yeah. Glad. And Simone, who's an artist, a designer and maker, and hopefully can tell us what it's like actually being out there making things. Topics I'm hoping to cover today include how the pandemic has affected the craft market, how we go about placing value on objects in general, how can makers and galleries reach new audiences, and I guess we should start with why on earth we feel the need, or we feel compelled, to collect things in the first place. So Corinne, maybe I will kick off with you. It's quite a small question. Why do we collect things, Corinne?
Well, I think it's actually, we're hardwired to collect. We're hardwired to make sense of the world. So that's how we understand the world. We pick things up, we touch them, we reorder them. And can I just ask in the audience, did any of you do things like collect buttons? Yep. Did any of you sort of collect flowers or bits of stuff you found when you were out walking? All of those things, that's collecting, because that's what we do. So yes, I am a collector in that sense. We like to have things that we find beautiful or appeal to us in some way, and then we order them, and then we tend to reorder them. So I think all of us collect in that sense. What I don't like as collectors, and as somebody who's had to show numerous, particularly American collectors around various craft fairs, is that they collect simply to have them and often, not all obviously, but to tick off on a list. And we've got one of those and 3 of those and 1 of those, and that was their period, and that's what they're for. And that particularly aggravates me with jewellery, which I suppose Grant would say I do collect. is because jewellery is about communicating with people. And the poor jewellery cannot communicate with people other than the person that's collected it when it's in a plan chest. And you do that and go, yes, jewellery is about wearing it. It's about it talking to me when I'm wearing it, but hopefully it talking to you about me wearing it. And we have a conversation. And I think, from my point of view, yes, so I do, in a way, collect jewellery because I love wearing jewellery. And it started a long time ago. And I guess it's a kind of addiction. I'm a jewelleryaholic. And I have lots of, Grant's been to my home. I've got lots of beautiful craft objects. But I've got them because I love them. They might have been a gift from the artist, or they might have just been things that are beautiful that I use. And I might use them not necessarily because they've got a straight function of being a teapot, but because they provoke me to think about things, or they calm me down, which, as you can tell, I often need doing.
Very good. Freud put our collecting down to anal retention, so that after babies have their excrement wiped and taken away from them, cleaned up, he said that's the reason we want to keep things. Having had things taken away from us, we want to keep it. I think one of my favourite collecting anecdotes was Mark Newson was on Imagine, the documentary, and they had one of his collectors. He was during that period where he was doing design art, and they had one of his collectors on, who was American. We seem to be having a go at an entire nation. He was an American. I think he was a hedge funder. It was at that time. It was before 2008, and he was surrounded by Newson's furniture and work. And Alan Yentob turned to him and said, "So what is it about Mark's work that you like?" And he kind of, you could see him thinking for a moment, and he could come out. Well, I don't know. I won't do the American accent, but it just makes me feel horny. That was it. Anyway, moving on swiftly. The pandemic. I think we probably ought to get into that because apparently it's been a thing for the past 18 months. I'm quite intrigued to know how the pandemic has affected your line of work, being an auction house.
It's been really interesting because actually, I think not just with Maak, but I think the wider craft market, certainly in terms of the secondary market, the last 18 months have probably been stronger than any time in the last 10 years, really. And we've seen a huge uptake in just a much higher number of people engaging with our auctions, many, many more people registering, bidding, participating in the auctions. And, we've seen some phenomenal prices as well being achieved, but it's not just about the prices achieved, it's just the audience growth. Right. Over the last 18 months has been stronger than
what are you putting that down to?
Time.
Right.
I think in the last 18 months, a lot of people have just been at home and had more time. And I think, so with the way that the Maak auctions work, we're quite hybrid. We've always been online with our bidding platform, so the auctions have always been online. But we've always then combined that with a gallery space where the exhibitions and the auctions are exhibited. So obviously with the pandemic, the biggest challenge for us was a logistical one, but actually we weren't able to do the exhibition side of things, so people weren't able to come and view things in person. But other than that, the way that our audience was engaging with us didn't need to change because we already had been online for 10 years at that point. So that was a massive benefit for us, and it just meant that we were used to communicating with people on that level. And so what we really found was that people are at home, people are stuck at home, they've got a lot more time on their hands to be browsing online, finding us, finding ceramics, finding things to be passionate about at a time where their worlds had become really quite small. And we just saw so many new people coming to ceramics, coming to collecting ceramics, or buying their first pots. And then it grows from there. And I think for a lot of people, if they had income security in whatever form that was, the one thing that they never had enough of previously was time, and that was now available to them.
And also, I guess it's the fact, and there have been a number of projects that have picked this up, I guess, over the past year or so, that you are stuck at home, and suddenly home is your entire horizon.
And you're going to want to fill it with beautiful things, because if that's all you're seeing, then actually and people aren't spending their money, they're not going on holidays, they're not going to the theatre, they're not going out for dinner. There is, if you've got that income security, you've got more capital to spend, so why not treat yourself? And we had a few people lots of people who really came at it with that attitude, with, I haven't spent £5,000 on that holiday that I didn't go on. I'm going to treat myself to something else instead, and something beautiful that I can live with every day. And that was a real factor for sure.
So, Simone, I'm interested from your perspective. We've heard the auction has gone terribly well by the sound of it, which is great. From your perspective, I mean, have you discovered that? Have you discovered that people aren't spending £5,000 on a holiday and they're going to buy your work instead?
I think that I'm going to have to talk about the Artist Support Pledge, which I think really was a real thing that kind of energized the creative community in a way, because when the pandemic happened, I feel like a lot of people, if they didn't have already a lot of commissions lined up, they suddenly went, what am I going to do? That show's been cancelled. How am I going to reach my audience? I was planning to show these new pieces of work in a space, and now I'm suddenly stuck at home with them in my studio. And for me, it became, I was working on, I had a kind of different experience, I think, than a lot of people. I kind of said, I can't go to my studio. I was in the middle of like moving house and changing my whole way of being and creating anyway. And I used it to start creating a new body of work. And then the Artist Support Pledge was there. It gave me a price point. It gave me a reason to share it earlier than I would.
Could we just can I just ask, does everybody know what the Artist Support Pledge is?
I'll explain it anyway.
Yeah,
so essentially it was, you're going to have to help me with the name because I'm really bad at names.
I'll try. I mean, my brain has gone the last 18 months.
It was set up as an initiative to encourage our creatives to make work and also for people to come and support makers. It was a £200 maximum price point, and you were going to make work, and if you had sold £1,000 of work, you were then encouraged to buy a work from another artist to continue supporting the community. And what I saw happening is a lot of makers who would normally have work in the thousands decided to make smaller objects, and it gave people who would not usually be able to access them, you know, an opportunity to buy a piece of their work and collect, which I think is amazing. And it meant that there was an interest, there was a buzz, there was a whole, it felt like a movement actually. Then it started to take off in different countries. It was American Artist Support Pledge and Australian artists, which was fantastic. So that was one of the things that happened. And I don't know how it affected other people, but for me, it made me feel like I was going to take this opportunity, which has kind of felt like a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Unfortunately, it's still going on in some ways. But at the time, I was like, this is going to be an opportunity for me to explore a new way of creativity and expression and not feel like I have to wait till everything's polished and perfect to present it to people. And it actually encouraged me to engage at a much earlier stage with my work and the exterior world. That's what I found.
Interesting. Can we talk about your experience, Lucy, at Cluster? I mean, because what Cluster does, I mean, it does other things as well, I'm sure, but it does do kind of pop-up exhibitions. The live experience is quite important to what you do, right?
Yeah, the live experience is a massive part of what we do. We predominantly run pop-up exhibitions in London, and really at the core of Cluster is community and connectivity. So when the pandemic hit, that was a big adjustment that we had to go through there. So for us, it was sort of transferring from a physical space into that digital space. So it was still really important for us to consider new ways in which we could engage with our artists and our makers. And for us, alongside our exhibitions, it's about involving industry and really providing that accessibility also for makers to come to know established members in the industry across design and craft. So, yeah, we've been working on a lot of different projects there. With our online shop as well, and a book publication that we've been working on. So really for us, it's just been adapting and coming up with new ways that we can support our artists.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, according to the Crafts Council, they did a report called The Market for Craft, or looked at the market for craft. It was commissioned before the pandemic, so it'd be interesting to see how that all washes out ultimately. But they said in this report, there's been a fourfold increase in the volume of craft objects bought annually between 2006 and 2020, from 5.6 million to 24.7 million objects. So are we seeing new buyers in this market? You're gasping, like you need to get something out, Corinne. Unbottle, uncork.
You've asked me now. No, I mean, actually, I think it's well, I don't want to go into the Crafts Council report. I think, yes, they have, but then it depends what you mean by craft.
Yeah.
And they have a very wide of things that I would put into crafting rather than the kind of things that perhaps the more edgy kind of things. I think right at the beginning of the pandemic, as a curator, I do a show called Future Heritage at Decorex, some of you may have been to, where I try to show makers at a range of stages, people who are recent graduates, but through to people who are long established, but try and encourage them to do new things. And of the 100 makers I've shown over the last couple of years, I rang every single one of them and talked at great length at the beginning of the pandemic and then partway through the pandemic. And at the beginning, all of them had everything cancelled and were really frightened, and some of them were really in dire circumstances. A couple of months later on, a number of those projects abroad had been re-established, even if they weren't actually going to have a physical presence immediately. Then various people stepped in, people like the Crafts Council and the Goldsmiths Company, and actually did really offer really good support. People started to pick up, and then the Artists Pledge, and then lots of people who hadn't been online got online individually, but other organisations, so it did help. But, so the people who are really established and how are known and are collectible have done really well, and some of them have done much better because they haven't had the kind of expenses they normally have. On the other hand, they've missed the interaction with people. A kind of medium level, yeah, they did okay, but young, new starters, yes, there are some who have done online, but actually to get a following and to be known has been really difficult. And it's also, yes, you can look on Instagram, but you need with craft to be able to touch it. It's about tactility. So for those people, and I feel very sorry for them, particularly young graduates, I think we've got 2 years of people who we really don't know, and we really have to strain to find out about. And I think there is a new market. I think a lot of people were at home, yes, all of that, they had more time, but definitely people felt, actually, I want something beautiful, and we can't touch people. And we suddenly all realize that touch is that we're hardwired for touch. We need to touch beautiful things. And if that's not a person, it's an object. And we actually started to appreciate those things. So I think there's been a different emphasis on that market. And now, I mean, I'm just in the middle of curating for this year's show, and I'm very interested to see how that develops. I think for some people have done very well, but I think there are a group of people who've actually fallen off the edge, and I don't know if they'll ever come back.
Well, hopefully there are events like this one that's happening next door that are looking at the generation, the 2 years that is missing, because I do think you're absolutely right, it's hugely important that we support these makers and artists who just haven't had the platforms that they traditionally have. I would quite like to pick up on talking about Instagram. I mean, this isn't strictly to do necessarily with collecting, but Simone, you had this extraordinary, I hope you don't mind talking about this, you had this extraordinary moment on Instagram during the pandemic.
I did, yeah.
I mean, can we talk a little bit about that and how you use social media as a tool for change?
I can't talk in depth about it,
Okay.
but I can say that the reason why it worked for me, so basically I had to call out to my creative community for support at some point to kind of help me assert my creative rights, let's say it like this. I'm talking in circles, but it's because I really can't talk directly, but hopefully you get an idea that I had to call out to my community. Now, what was really interesting for me, it was a huge learning curve, but I had faith at the stage of going forward, against all other advice, behind scenes, that when I did this, it was the right thing to do. Now, at the start of this incident, I had about 900 followers. That didn't bother me, because I knew that the people who were following me were genuine and followed me because of what I was doing. And that's kind of what I think we need to understand when we're talking about social media. So when Corinne's talking about students not having that support, when they left university and they wanted to reach out and sell work via online, they didn't have those 900 followers, which is not necessarily a lot, but if they're the right 900 followers, they're going to make that step for you. So when I did that call out to the community and said, you know, this is what's happened to me, have a look, what do you think? It was actually as I expected. because people who were following me were already invested in my journey, in my story. They knew my work, they knew what I had put into it, and that kind of backbone is kind of what makes craft special. I don't think you have it in many other communities, and it was really the reason why I want to say it worked. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't talk about it more clearly. Sorry.
Well, I won't press you on it for legal reasons by the sound of it. But out of interest, you started with 900 followers. How many followers on Instagram do you have now?
Almost 16,000.
Yeah, right. Interesting. And are those people engaged with you in a different way than those first 900?
Yes, actually. And this is the other side of it. What I don't think people realize is if you are going to share your story, people are now going to be interested in what you have to say. So actually, it comes with a lot of responsibility. And I can't just go on there and be... I actually have to be quite balanced. I went on and said something around the Black Lives Matter movement. And then one of my friends who was an artist said, well, I'm not sure about that. And I had to think about it and then go, maybe you're right, and then come back and say something else, which was maybe
but it's
a
nice
bit
you
more
can have
balanced.
that kind of nuanced conversation, because quite often that isn't the case, right?
But I think that's also to do with how people choose to use the platform. I think that is something that's a culture that's growing more and more, and that's actually the bad side of it. We need to be able to make mistakes and grow, or to say things that are not necessarily usual, because how else are we going to come to equal grounds with other people? That's how it should be, in my opinion.
No, interesting. I mean, can we talk, so I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit away from Instagram, but also to talk about cluster, and, I mean, you're looking at young makers, but are you also trying to find a younger or a different audience? Do you recognise what the Crafts Council was saying in this report?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I really recommend for those that haven't seen the Crafts Council report, check it out. And I think for us, just in following that, we definitely saw a different audience, and also for the buyers and collectors and people getting interested and wanting to invest in craft, that really started to change as well. I think it has been, and it is starting to be, a much younger audience, and there's an interesting story there. I mean, why is that coming about? Is it that perhaps younger people want to start investing in craft people's stories, in what they have to say? So definitely a new crowd coming
We
through.
see that a lot in the secondary market as well, where if you look at your kind of demographic for collectors 10 years ago, they were usually coming at it from quite an academic perspective, and they were coming to us already knowing quite a lot about ceramics and having a clear idea of where the direction of their collecting was going, whereas the demographic has become much younger, much broader. And I think, obviously, we focus specifically on ceramics rather than the broader crafts, but I think it's probably universal amongst crafts that the entry point can be really accessible for people, and I think that's really important, because it does make it accessible to a younger audience. And whereas a younger audience, I think, tends to come to us because they've seen ceramics and it speaks to them, they love it, and they're coming at it from an aesthetic point where they want to buy something that's beautiful and speaks to them. And then the collecting element almost grows off that over a period of time. Whereas I think previously people were almost already collectors by the time they were coming to the secondary market and starting to buy at auction and filling in those gaps.
So we're getting into the definition of what collecting is up to a point, right? So it's a spectrum.
I think there really is, because I think there's some people who are, like I said, highly academic. Some people, and I'd probably class myself under, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a collector. There are just some things that are too beautiful to let someone else have them, and you have to.
They speak to you.
And you want to live with beautiful things.
And maybe
I think
I'm intrigued, whoever wants to can pick this up, but intrigued by the dividing line between collecting and hoarding. I mean, we were talking earlier, we're not supposed to break the illusion, but we did talk earlier. That happens, we had coffee and everything. We were talking earlier about Bill Esme, who very famously had a very small house with a huge number of pots in it, like every surface was a pot. So is he a collector or is he a hoarder? And is there a difference? What is the difference?
I think the difference is if there's direction to that hoarding, if there's consideration to the hoarding. I would say a hoarder is accumulating things regardless and hasn't thought about each acquisition, whereas I think a collector will think about each and every acquisition, even if to the outside eye, there's no rhyme or reason that they've considered it. And we sold, Maak sold a single owner collection or a kind of a substantial a selection from a single owner collection in May last year. And it was very similar, you know, a very modest kind of 2-bedroom apartment in a very nondescript block. And you'd have no idea from the outside in that you opened that door and what lay beneath. And every single surface, from the bathroom to the kitchen to the living room to the study, every surface is covered in pots. It was just phenomenal.
I love the idea of somebody having a bath with
Yeah,
pots.
no, literally. You're lying in the bath and he had things on the wall, things above the loo, things, you know, next to his toothbrush.
It's a hymn.
Yeah, yeah.
Are they generally hymns, the people that collect in that way, in your experience, I wonder?
Anecdotally, I'd say yes. Whether there is an element of, I mean, I wouldn't know the statistics, but from experience, I would say more often than not, people who live with that intensely have more often than not been men.
I mean, I want to come back to the spectrum of collecting, Corinne, because I know that you have things you want to say about that. But I just want to, just for a moment, Marijke, just ask about, because we talked a lot about the money bubbling up from younger people from the bottom or below, if you like. I mean, is money, you just sold a Magdalena Dundo pot for really quite a lot of money.
Quite a bit of money,
Quite a lot of money.
It was.
Well done, you.
Thanks.
And so is there money coming from, I don't know, the fine art market that maybe
Yeah,
is new
I
to the
think
craft?
there has definitely been more crossover, and I think more people who have traditionally been contemporary art collectors moving into the three-dimensional form. And I think that those boundaries that have always been there and always endlessly discussed between craft and fine art, and I think they are breaking down. And I think
why are they breaking down? Maybe I can start something between you two about that.
I think perhaps as materials used within a contemporary art context have broadened, it's opened the doors for people to consider craft materials which use a lot of those materials to be considered on that same platform. And I think that you've got more and more shows where kind of craft and design is being shown alongside contemporary art. And I think the historic price point differences between contemporary craft and art, with craft being more accessible and at a more affordable price point, when a contemporary artist comes in and sees, one of the best examples by one of the biggest names in ceramics, the price point for that, even at we set a world record for a living artist, for a living ceramic artist, but, at £250,000, that's not vast within the contemporary art spectrum.
It's relative,
Exactly, and so I think that has also kind of helped, that you don't have to be one of the top 10 collectors in contemporary art to be able to afford the top of the contemporary craft. And I think all of those barriers are starting to blur, and I think are starting to open up more.
Do you agree with that?
I think it's happened, but I think it's partly money. It's partly also, I think, a move by some of those top-end collectors. They've got this incredible art. A lot of it is in storage because it isn't sort of art that you can actually show in your apartment. And you look at these people, I always sort of look at the difference between what was frieze and pad and what used to be Origin at the Crafts Council, and the sort of what people collected. And you would go around frieze and you would see all the women dressed up to their nines, and I won't go into my riff on that, but with wearing the most conventional, very expensive jewellery, but incredibly conventional. At Pad, somehow a little bit more interesting. And at Origin, they were wearing interesting, challenging. They were taking their art for a walk, which is what I reckon I do every day. And I think that's what's interesting. And I think that some of those people in the top-end price bracket have begun to realise that their homes and their person are also a way of demonstrating what they collect, or their wealth, or their understanding of intellectual concepts. And so that is beginning to change about what they want. I think the other thing is, there's also been a kind of, over the pandemic, there's been the fact that things have been online, so you have an international market in a way that you didn't before, and an international audience. I've done, as I know Grant's done, a number of in-conversations for various events with makers and artists, and what's been fascinating is to see the number of people from around the world, and really around the world, who've taken part, and as a result have bought, at the end, over the next couple of days, have bought things from the people that you've had in conversations with, which is very rewarding, and that has broadened that horizon.
I mean, as a practitioner, you're breaking boundaries, right? You do a bit of everything.
Yes, I do.
That makes it sound like...
I know, but yeah, it's actually true.
But very well, you do it very well. But there's art, there's craft, there's design.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
Was that a deliberate, conscious decision to cross boundaries?
I get asked that question a lot, and I think it's...
I never ask an original question.
No, but this is just... I think it's more to do with me, but because... I do quite a lot of different things, and I think that that's because I'm not a very clever person. No, and I'll be more serious in my answer. I think that I have decided to follow what I'm passionate about, and I start to get passionate about many different things. So I like making, and I start making. Isn't this fun? And then I go and I end up talking to someone who makes me want to make something else or want to do something else. And I feel, because I studied architecture, I feel very confident in moving, I guess, from different scales and moving and trying and questioning. But the downside to that is that I really think if I could give advice to a younger audience or anyone who wants to be a creative person, is you also have to really focus on building your voice and your language and learning how to communicate what that means. Now, it's taken me over 10 years, it's taken me closer to 20 years for people to be comfortable with that. Because I remember when I did my graduation had ceramics in there, it had furniture in there, it had bags. I would not advise someone to do this for their graduation, because what people had said to me at the time was, so you don't know what you're doing then. But what I was really doing was engaging with my creativity in a way that was uncomfortable for other people. Now that's fine, and that's me, and it's taken me a long time to do a large enough body of work in each field that people actually understand that that's just who I am. But it doesn't necessarily work for everyone, because it really is important as a creative individual to have a body of work behind you that makes people confident enough to buy and collect in you. That's really what it is. You want to show people that you're not here for a moment, you're literally invested in this, you want to become part of the legacy of the craft that you're in. And if you're not going to do that, people don't want to take you seriously. And I actually think that's fair enough, because there are many people out there who are living their craft, and that's what you're entering. Really.
For all the different disciplines that you cover, the art and the jewellery or the furniture design, are your audiences discrete, or do you get people who buy your work across the board?
Yes, I do, but that's not often. So normally people come to me and they realize I do other things. I get people coming to me because I've done jewellery, and then they see my furniture. And what's nice is when they start, because I've now got a big enough body of work, people can understand the translation of language and the concepts that happen. And that has been a benefit, but it's kind of a benefit that's only coming into play 10, 15 years later when I have that body of work. What I'd find earlier is I might have one piece of furniture and 50 pieces of jewellery, and everyone wants to call me a jeweller when my next project is a furniture piece.
Is that really frustrating?
It really is, yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating, because I've always edited, when I used to be a magazine editor and journalist, the magazines that I did always had a really broad spectrum of activity, particularly when I was doing Blueprint, which went from architecture to photography to contemporary culture, as we called it. And I remember doing reader survey, towards the back end, whenever anybody says do a reader survey as an editor, you always know your time is basically coming to an end. But anyway, I did a reader survey, and we discovered that actually, all the readers, they liked their little disciplines. The architects liked buildings on sunny days with nobody in them. The furniture designers wanted more furniture. The industrial designers wanted more industrial design, and the graphic designers wanted more graphics. they weren't. I mean, people like to compartmentalise.
It's collecting though, because
Yeah.
normally people who collect shoes don't collect bags, or don't, you know, it's like they just well maybe both.
But I think, but Sean, one of the things is it's also about stories, and and it's part of your creative language. So I think one of the things, and it goes back to your comment about fine art, is, I'm actually chair of something called the Critics Circle Visual Arts and Architecture section, which Grant is a member. So I write actually across fine art through architecture and craft and design, and I get myself into quite a lot of trouble, normally, because I say sweeping generalizations like, well, what's really interesting about contemporary craft is, and I really believe this, is you get huge intellectual rigor. I mean, really very, very thoughtful people with socking great narratives. And that's what we've all wanted, and we've wanted that very much during lockdown. And people, again, who are exploring tactility, but are pushing processes and techniques. And with contemporary craft, that's what you get. And so you get head, heart, and hands in a way you simply don't get in fine art, although fine art is beginning to go more in that direction, because for 15 or 20 years it was so goddamn conceptual that you could only store it in a storage place. You didn't have, it wasn't, you don't have a film running of all the time on your wall. Well, very few of us do. And I think actually what happened is that contemporary craft offers a very different proposition of all those three things, and narrative has become so important. But narrative is also is your story and your language. So in fact, I think more people will understand that you do all those things.
It's happening slowly, yeah. It's good.
But I think it's the human touch, to jump in, sorry.
But
I think it's the human touch that is integral to craft and the appeal of craft. And I think that's why it appeals so much, and I think that's why the connection with the artist is often, or the craft maker, is such an important part for so many collectors, because it's the human interaction, and it's that embodied in an object, and it's having that human interaction with an object that craft gives in a way that so many other disciplines don't give, and some craft objects will give more than other craft objects. So we see, for our collectors, there's that tactile element to ceramics that then will often influence other areas that they collect in, but you won't see other disciplines that don't have that tactile quality.
Well, I'm keen to talk about other disciplines, because Lucy, cluster isn't just a crafts thing. You have a photography, you have a fine art. I mean, do your audiences go across those different disciplines, or are they quite discrete?
I guess it's sort of a mixture. Yeah, we're quite diverse in that way. So just as you mentioned, we have 4 different disciplines. So we cover across photography, print, jewellery, craft, and illustration. So it's a wide diversity of themes and really what styles we focus on as well. So, but there is also that crossover of people sort of having that interest in jewellery and craft. I mean, for one of our first exhibitions that we did for craft, we also exhibited jewellers there. But then we thought there was that audience that was really just looking for jewellery, and we thought to give that its voice, we would separate the 2 disciplines, and that was really where that came from.
Right. Interesting. I'm keen, because narrative has come up quite a lot. You're working with all these makers. Do you help sharpen their narratives? Do you impose your own narrative on top of that? How does that relationship work?
It's in a very natural and organic relationship, so it's important for us to really come to learn and connect with the maker. So just as we've been talking about with narratives, I think it's important to really understand the maker's narrative, where they've come from, their story of what type of work they're really trying to put out in the audience. And that's sort of where we've seen that shift towards the digital as well. So a lot of artists now doing behind-the-scenes videos and gallery tours, and we've really seen that as a really influential way to give collectors that eye that perhaps they wouldn't see at a traditional gallery show. It's that sort of walk through into their life that I think is important.
I mean, I've got for people in the audience, I have a clock in front of me. This monitor is telling me exactly how long I have left, which is 6 minutes and 8 seconds, or 6 seconds.
Gone.
And if I go over, apparently the chair flips back a bit like at the end of Brand. So we only have 6 minutes to get into this. But I'm keen to talk a little bit about value and how we perceive value and what things cost and why. Marijke, because it seems to me we've got people at your end at the start of their career. You're selling things, maybe not towards the back end or the middle of people's careers when they suddenly become rather more expensive.
Yeah.
So how do you get from this end of the spectrum to that end of the spectrum? Who wants to take that?
Well, I think from our perspective, the things are worth what, for an auction kind of setup, what two people are willing to pay for it. That's what it comes down to, on a purely basis terms, and in sense of valuing anything, it's arbitrary, surely. It's what two people want to pay for it. It's difficult. So I will put a guide price on an auction based on what comparable works have made for in the past. But it's not down to me what the final hammer price on a piece is going to be. I see you really,
you want to get in.
I'm
not even having to look at you. How do you value yourself? This is the key.
Right, no, but that's the question. You've actually answered it, because for me, on one level, I completely agree with what you're saying, and I realise that becomes the job of the creator to educate the audience, but it's also your job and your job. And actually everyone on this stage's job. Because what we're trying to do is say, this isn't just an object. Someone has invested time to make this piece. So I'll give you a personal story. I remember I was showing at a craft fair, and to be honest, I find them difficult because you have to sit in one place a long time and smile. I'm not that person. But I was showing at a craft fair, and someone came up and they really loved this ring that I'd made. And then they asked me how much it was, and I told them. And they were like, Mano. They were telling me, Mano, but you're not a designer. And that was the wrong thing to say.
Yeah, I get that sense.
No, but it's because
it's a weird thing to say as well.
No, yeah, but it's to do with perceptions, and it's a much bigger conversation than this room. What we're doing is, I am trying to sell something that took me, I had to educate myself, I had to skill myself, I had to buy the material that's already a precious metal, had to buy all of the objects in my studio to make that piece. I then had to invest the time to make that piece whilst paying the rent for my studio. Look, this goes on. Forget even if it's the best thing that you've ever seen today that you had to come and actually talk to me about it, okay? And then you tell me that it's overpriced. What are we actually talking about
But
here?
it's the thought time, isn't it? I mean, I think that's one of the things that actually, bless you, one of the major things about contemporary craft, as I've said earlier, is that there is huge intellectual rigor, and people who think, and I would often say in fine art there was that whole movement of being conceptual, or not engaging with the physical and not really engaging with the mental thing. They didn't do it themselves. They handed it to assistants, all of that stuff. And in craft, people really think long and hard. They have this story that they're trying to engage with, and they're actually doing it themselves. And that gives all of it a huge value. You can't quantify. I know you can quantify in an auction, but actually the secondary market's not
market, and it needs to start at the primary market.
And that's what I consider my job as a journalist and as a curator. Is to try and say to people, look, these people are amazing. Just kind of come and lean in and find out about it. And in Future Heritage, which I do at Decorex, it was precisely because I felt people in the interior design market didn't really have the opportunity to see people like Simone, and they didn't experience these things, and it's been an educative process. This is now going to be the 8th year. And at the beginning, interior designers came on and went, yeah. But now people come straight to it because they're excited by it. And I hope that that's really what this section of talks is going to do as well.
Well, me too. We have 1 minute and 31 seconds left. So I think because you've all given up your time, I was just wondering if you have something you need to alert people to. We have an audience both here and at home. Something that you're doing that maybe you should let them know about.
Well, we've always got our ongoing schedule of auctions. So I guess we'll be having, I can't really talk about it quite yet. But no,
that's a really rubbish plug.
I know, it is really bad. Put me on the spot. So we've got a couple of auctions happening in the autumn, November and December. So if you keep an eye on the Maak website, we'll be announcing more
Mac
shortly.
website, November, December, announcement, big. Corinne.
I guess I made the plug already. Future Heritage, 10th to the 13th of October at Olympia at Decorex. Please come.
Simone.
Check me out on Instagram. I'm currently working on a listening bench for the Greenwich Peninsula and some behind-the-scenes projects with larger companies.
You're all being very opaque about what's going on. You're giving people an opportunity here. Lucy, tell me, you can tell me what's
With
happening.
full
in your
transparency,
world. Yeah,
we're getting a book published, and that will be out for London Craft Week. So it's a great opportunity to see our makers. There'll be over 100 artists in this book, and also doing a series of public interventions. So check the streets of London, and you'll see some artists out there. So.
Great. And look, 4 seconds left. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much to the panel. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much to the audience for coming. You have no idea how exciting it is to see people, even if it's slightly dark. It's wonderful. If you're at home and watching on the streaming, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Maybe if we can give everybody a round of applause, give each other a round of applause.
Thank you for coming. People allowed to ask questions?
We have had such a fascinating session this morning. Goodness me, from supporting makers to the new demographic of collectors, to choosing a piece for its unique story, to choosing a piece because it just speaks to you. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Simone. Thank you very much, Corinne. Thank you, Marijke and Grant, as always, for chairing it so beautifully. Let's give them another clap.